The most important age in history, the Bronze Age. Bronze, of course, is a copper alloy. It's copper and tin for the most part, but also it describes the Bronze Age, and there is also a part of the Bronze Age called the Late Bronze Age Collapse, and I would also, as a historian, add to that the secondary Bronze Age collapse, creation of my own, because the late Bronze Age collapse, which happened from about 1200 BC onwards for about 100, 150 years, is the one that is most often cited. But we're going to talk about the Bronze Age because bronze, the metal, and the Bronze Age is probably the most important age in history, and it's an age that gets not enough historical consideration and emphasis. So let's get to it. As I say, bronze is a copper alloy. Copper and tin normally, but it sometimes has other metals in there, and metalloids as well, for those of you who use that terminology. The Bronze Age is about 3000 BC to 1000 BC. That's its generally considered a consensus time frame. Before that, beginning of it is the Chalcolithic, the Copper Age, and that's part of the Stone Age as well that went for a very long time indeed before that. But the importance of bronze, but let's talk about copper to start off with, because bronze, even though it started in 3000 BC, it wasn't widely used in 3000 BC. The importance about copper, native copper, that would have been mined, and later bronze, which is a copper alloy, is that it's not like iron and steel. You don't need high heat to make copper tools, right? And steel and iron can be brittle. Steel wasn't really made till 400 BC, I think, in India first. So copper was the workhorse of tools, because even though it was very soft, the point about it is that if it bends out of shape, you don't need as much heat as iron to put it back into place. So it's fantastic. They used it significantly in the building of the pyramids, and they sharpen the tools every hour. So copper, it's soft, sure, but you can repurpose it, retool it on the spot where you're using it. You don't need a blast furnace to do it. You just need normal heat. It's got a lot going for it in tooling, which is surprising, right? Because these days, in the modernizing world we live in, we use very tough metals. Tungsten, we use titanium alloys, aluminium alloys, magnesium. The list goes on. And nickel, of course. Good old nickel and molybdenum and even rhenium. Fantastic metals that could only have been dreamed of in the Bronze Age from what we're in, the Space Age. But the point is, copper actually makes a lot of sense. You probably couldn't make the pyramids with anything other than copper tools, right? Because the pyramids are made out of stone, but they were made with copper tools mentioned in the papyrus, even of the fourth dynasty, right? So the Great Pyramid of Cheops, and then his son Djedefre, his father Znefru. Copper was the tools that was used at the time to build those, okay? Without which you couldn't build the pyramids, right? There's no way you could do with iron and steel and other metals because they didn't exist, number one. Number two, that you could never repurpose them in time. Right? You couldn't keep it going for hundreds of years, which they did in the fourth and fifth dynasty and the third dynasty. So, copper and bronze is fundamental. Fundamental, as the Bronze Age, as a name suggests. But, and here's the point, you rely on copper, and then you will overutilize it. And my God, did the Egyptians overutilize it? I don't blame them. I would have done it as well. Copper, fantastic metal. Favorite of mine, I actually collect native copper. But the point is, because the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians of the 3rd, 4th, 5th dynasty overutilized copper, by the time you came to the Middle Kingdom and then the New Kingdom, they had to look elsewhere for copper. Now, the Egyptians were already importing through Wadi al-Jaf from the Sinai Peninsula in the 4th dynasty, so 2600 BC, but they had to go further and further out for copper. And in the end, basically, you had King Solomon with King Solomon's mines at Timnah, owned by the Edomites, but effectively run by the state of Israel at the time under King Solomon, David's son, and he was very successful. He reformed the mines, we know that from archaeology, and he made a fortune and made the state of Israel incredibly rich, built the first temple. So the Bronze Age was magnificent, right, from 3000 to 1000 BC. And King Narmer, say the first pharaoh, 3100 BC, combining the crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt. So that made the first pharaoh, or first emperor. So you're talking about a whole different way of conceiving power, kingship, autocracy, so on and so forth. And of course, it worked for the Egyptians because they had the Nile. Plenty of food every year until they had intermediate periods, drought, so on and so forth. That wasn't so much fun. But the Egyptians had the bank balance to acquire products from all over the world, thousands of kilometers away, to build their magnificent edifices, mainly pyramids and mortuary temples, funerary rites, rituals, and objects. And that really created the concept of power, the concept of pharaoh. Right? Pharaoh comes out of the Bible as well as the ultimate king, who's rowing with God and rowing with Moses and rowing with everyone, basically. And to be fair, that's probably the case. The volcano at Santorini went off in, I think, about 1600 BC or 1500, and there was chaos basically from that time onwards. Amenhotep the Fourth changed his name to Akhenaten, became a monotheist, set up his own capital in Egypt. Then there was a whole lot of unrest. Tutankhamun, or Tutankhamun, as some people pronounce it, died early. His wife, Ankhesenamun, had to marry someone else. She wanted to marry a Hittite because she was scared about people at home. It was a mess. Now, we ended up with Ramesses the Great coming through, and he was a great king, but a great pharaoh. But the problem was it was sort of an oasis of success in a bit of a disaster. So the notion that the late Bronze Age collapse started in 1200 BC is really a bit of rose-coloured glasses. I would date the late Bronze Age collapse starting from about 15, even 1600 BC, from the time that Santorini went off as a volcano. It started getting difficult from there. And the Egyptians were probably getting help from the Hebrews, which was their name before they later became known as the Jews, as middle managers, helping them with all their grandiose projects and whatever else. The Egyptians thought big. Got to hand it to them. Ancient Egyptians thought big, and they needed all sorts of people to help them. And they brought all sorts of tribes in to help them. But, the community wasn't happy from 1600, 1500 BC onwards, and it just got worse and worse. There were some oases in that time. Amenhotep III, Ramesses II, also known as Ramesses the Great, they were very successful. They had new ideas, some reforms, so on and so forth. They started using the Valley of the Kings, but at the end of the day, things were getting worse and worse. The Hittites were on the decline as well in the 13th century BC, so well before the 12th century BC. And when the Sea Peoples attacked in the 12th century BC, well, that was just a disaster. You had the start of the Third Intermediate Period. Ramesses III in the 12th century BC, here he was assassinated. Poor chap, there was a famine, so being a pharaoh could be dangerous. It was often dangerous, actually. But then my next point is that whilst we had the late Bronze Age collapse from what some historians say 1200 BC onwards, and it was obviously before then, in my opinion, you had what I call the secondary Bronze Age collapse, because around 1000 BC, the Davidic dynasty in Israel was started with David, and then his son Solomon. And Solomon was Solomon the Wise, Solomon the Great, gets an epithet because he was fantastic. A brilliant king, made a fortune, built the first temple, really cemented the state of Israel and the Jewish people as a nation. Full marks to him. By that, and the state of Israel was very successful for about 400 or 500 years. But by that stage, you had not just the Egyptians there, although they were much weakened, but you had the Assyrians and the Babylonians. The Hittites were gone by now. We're talking about the 10th century BC. So you had the state of Israel, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, and the Egyptians all warring with each other. And you're probably aware that there's a Wailing Wall in Jerusalem where they bemoan the loss of the first temple. Well, that did happen. The Babylonians came in and trashed the place in 586 BC. But it wasn't, we need to remember that it wasn't just the first temple that got, and the first state of Israel that got broken up at that time. The Babylonians, shortly after, got crushed as well themselves. And the Assyrians got crushed before. And the Egyptians were in trouble as well. So I would call that the secondary Bronze Age collapse, because the Assyrians and the Babylonians and the Israelis and the Egyptians, once they started fighting with each other, they were all going to come unstuck. And they did in a very short period of time. From the Assyrians in 610 BC, I think, and the state of Israel, and then the Babylonians, they got knocked over by the Persians, and the Egyptians were always in trouble. Those four states just all ended up collapsing in a very short period of time. The Persians came in, of course, under Cyrus, although he got knocked off later. Cyrus emancipated the Jewish community from Babylon, but ultimately, after the Persians did quite well, they ended up annoying the Greeks to the point whereby they got defeated in the Persian Wars, of course, in the 5th century BC, but then in the second half of the 4th century BC, you had Alexander the Great, who came back for payback and went right through Asia Minor, Egypt, Persia, and all the way to India and even Afghanistan. You might even say that was the outer reaches of the secondary Bronze Age collapse. Everyone came a cropper. But most importantly, you had the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and the state of Israel all collapsing in a century. Fundamental to the way the world is now. We've all grown out of that. But to the extent it's properly understood, not so much. I'm afraid not so much. Thanks.